The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Susie Walker stood clutching her worn leather purse in the lobby of St. Catherine's emergency shelter. The intake coordinator, a tired woman with kind eyes, was explaining the overnight procedures when the glass doors swung open behind her. Susie turned, expecting to see her son Michael walking back through those doors with an apologetic smile, maybe carrying coffee and donuts like he used to when they'd argue and make up. Instead, she watched his black BMW pull away from the curb, taillights disappearing into the October rain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The coordinator's voice grew distant as the reality settled over Susie like a cold fog. Her own son had just dropped her off at a homeless shelter and driven away. Not because she was actually homeless, not because she needed help, but because he thought it was funny. Because somehow, in his 32 years of life, Michael Walker had decided that humiliating his 60-year-old mother was entertainment. She could still hear his laughter echoing in her ears, the way he'd doubled over when she'd looked confused at the shelter entrance. "Come on, Mom, it's just a joke. You're always so dramatic about everything. Stay here for a night. Maybe you'll appreciate what you have." His voice had carried that familiar, condescending tone she'd grown to recognize over the past few years, the one that made her feel small and foolish for having feelings at all. Susie stood there holding the plastic bag containing a change of clothes he'd hastily thrown together, realizing that her son genuinely believed she deserved this moment of terror and confusion. The woman behind the desk was still talking, but all Susie could think about was the look in Michael's eyes when he'd driven off. Not guilt, not concern, amusement. Susie Walker had never imagined that love could be used as a weapon against her, especially not by the child she'd spent 32 years protecting, nurturing, and believing in. But as she sat on the narrow cot in the emergency shelter that night, listening to the whispered conversations and restless movements of women whose circumstances had led them to this place legitimately, she began to trace the path that had brought her here. She wasn't like the other women in this room. She had a home, a beautiful 2-story house on Elm Street with a garden she'd tended for 15 years. She had savings, investments, a successful consulting business she'd built from nothing. She had everything except the one thing she'd wanted most: a son who saw her as more than an inconvenience. Susie had been 17 when she'd discovered she was pregnant with Michael. The boy who'd gotten her pregnant had disappeared the moment, she'd told him, leaving her to face her parents' disappointment and the whispered judgments of their small town in Nebraska. Her mother had wanted her to give the baby up for adoption. Her father had wanted her to move away where no one knew them. But Susie had looked at that ultrasound image and known with absolute certainty that this child was hers to love and protect. She'd worked 3 jobs through her pregnancy, saving every penny she could while finishing high school through evening classes. When Michael was born, tiny and perfect with his father's dark hair and her own stubborn chin, Susie had made a promise that would define the next 3 decades of her life. No matter what it took, no matter what she had to sacrifice, her son would never want for anything. He would never feel abandoned the way she had felt when his father walked away. The early years had been a blur of exhaustion and determination. Susie cleaned offices at night while Michael slept in a car seat beside her desk. She worked retail during the day while he played quietly in the break room. She'd learned to survive on 3 hours of sleep, instant coffee, and the fierce love that drove her to keep going when everything in her body wanted to collapse. When Michael turned 5, Susie made the decision that would change both their lives forever. She moved them to Chicago, where opportunity felt possible, and the past couldn't follow them. She'd enrolled in community college, studying business, administration while Michael was in school, working nights to pay for both their education and their tiny apartment in a neighborhood that was safe but far from fancy. Those were the years Susie remembered most fondly, when Michael would do his homework at the kitchen table while she studied for her own tests. They'd quiz each other over dinner, celebrate good grades with ice cream from the corner store, and dream together about the future they were building. Michael had been her partner then, her little champion who would cheer when she passed an exam, and who understood that their sacrifices were temporary, building blocks toward something better. Susie had graduated with honors and immediately found work at a small marketing firm, starting as an assistant but quickly proving herself indispensable. She had a natural gift for understanding what people wanted and how to give it to them, a talent that had been honed by years of reading Michael's moods, anticipating his needs, and smoothing the rough edges of their life together. By the time Michael started middle school, Susie had been promoted twice and was earning enough to move them to a better apartment with 2 bedrooms and a view of the park. She'd furnished Michael's room first, making sure he had everything he needed for school and activities, while she continued sleeping on a fold-out couch in the living room for another year until she could afford a proper bedroom set. High school brought new challenges and new dreams. Michael had shown an aptitude for technology and business, often helping Susie with her computer problems and showing an interest in her work that made her heart swell with pride. They would talk about his future over dinner, planning his college, applications, and discussing the internships she could help him find through her growing network of professional contacts. Susie had been promoted to account manager by then and had started taking freelance consulting projects on weekends to build what she called their college fund. Every extra dollar went into savings, every bonus was carefully invested. She wore the same clothes for years, drove a used car until it literally wouldn't run anymore, and packed lunch every day while Michael got money for the cafeteria because she wanted him to fit in with his classmates. When Michael's senior year arrived, Susie had saved enough to send him to any college he wanted. He'd been accepted to Northwestern University with a partial scholarship, and Susie had gladly paid the remaining tuition, room, and board costs. She'd driven him to campus that first day in August, helping him move into his dorm room and meeting his roommate's parents, who seemed surprised when they learned she was a single mother. "You should be very proud," the roommate's father had told her. "Not many kids from single-parent homes make it to a school like this." Susie had smiled politely, but the comment had stung. As if being raised by one parent who loved him completely was somehow a disadvantage rather than a blessing. As if the fact that she'd worked multiple jobs and sacrificed everything to give Michael opportunities somehow made her family less than. College was when the changes began, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced with each semester. Michael started talking differently, using phrases Susie didn't recognize and developing opinions about things he'd never cared about before. He became critical of their apartment when he came home for breaks, making comments about the furniture being outdated or the neighborhood not being nice enough. He started asking why she'd never remarried, why she'd never done more with her life. Susie had tried to explain that she had done something with her life. She'd raised him, built a career, created a stable home for them both. But Michael seemed to view her choices through a different lens now, seeing sacrifice where she saw love, limitation where she saw dedication. The summer after his sophomore year, Michael had landed an internship at a tech company through a connection Susie had made for him. He'd lived at home to save money, but instead of being grateful for the opportunity to avoid debt, he'd complained constantly about having to take the train downtown, about the small size of his childhood bedroom, about the way Susie still worried about him and wanted to know where he was going. "You're so clingy, Mom," he'd said one evening when she'd asked him to call if he was going to be out past midnight. "I'm 20 years old. You can't keep treating me like a child." Susie had backed off, giving him more space and independence, but the criticism had hurt. She wasn't being clingy. She was being a mother who cared about her son's safety. But Michael seemed to interpret every expression of love as an attempt to control him. By his senior year, the distance between them had grown even wider. Michael rarely called unless he needed something, and his visits home became shorter and filled with tension. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He'd graduated with honors and immediately landed a job at a prestigious consulting firm, a position Susie had helped him prepare for by practicing interview questions and helping him buy his first professional wardrobe. The day after graduation, Michael had told her he was moving to a luxury apartment downtown with 2 college friends. He hadn't asked if she needed help with anything or whether she'd be okay living alone for the first time in over 20 years. He'd simply announced his decision and asked her to co-sign the lease because his credit wasn't established enough yet. Susie had signed the papers, helped him with the security deposit, and driven him to his new apartment with a carload of furniture and household items she'd bought for his new place. She'd hugged him goodbye in the lobby of his sleek building and driven home to an apartment that felt cavernous and silent without his presence. That was when Susie had decided to make her own changes. With Michael launched and independent, she finally had the freedom to focus on her own dreams. She'd saved enough money over the years to start her own consulting business, and she'd spent months researching the market, developing a business plan, and building a client base before finally leaving her corporate job. Walker Consulting Solutions had started small, with Susie working from her dining room table and taking meetings at coffee shops. But her reputation for delivering results had grown quickly, and within 2 years she'd moved to a proper office space and was earning more than she ever had as an employee. The business had thrived beyond her wildest expectations. Susie had a natural gift for helping companies streamline their operations and improve their customer relationships. Her client list had grown to include several major corporations, and she'd been featured in business magazines as an example of successful entrepreneurship. With her newfound financial stability, Susie had finally been able to buy her own home, the house on Elm Street that she'd fallen in love with at first sight. It had good bones but needed updating, and she'd thrown herself into the renovation project with the same determination she'd brought to everything else in her life. Michael had visited occasionally during those first few years after college, usually when he needed something, or when he was between relationships and feeling lonely. Susie had welcomed him warmly each time, cooking his favorite meals and listening to his stories about work and dating and the challenges of adult life in the city. But something had shifted in their dynamic that Susie couldn't quite pinpoint. Michael seemed to view her success with suspicion rather than pride. When she'd shown him the featured article about her business, he'd made a comment about how she was finally doing something worthwhile with her life, as if everything she'd done before hadn't mattered. When she'd proudly given him a tour of her renovated house, he'd focused on the things that weren't perfect yet, rather than appreciating how far she'd come. "You really should have hired a professional for the kitchen," he'd said, running his finger along a slightly uneven tile edge. "This kind of DIY stuff just looks cheap." Susie had laughed it off at the time, telling herself that Michael was just being perfectionist the way she'd taught him to be. But the comments had accumulated. Over the years, each one a small cut that healed slowly and left a barely visible scar. The worst part was that Michael seemed to have developed a narrative about their past that bore little resemblance to Susie's memories. In his version, she had been overprotective and limiting rather than supportive and encouraging. He talked about feeling smothered by her attention and constrained by their modest lifestyle, conveniently forgetting that their modest lifestyle had been the foundation that launched him into his current success. He never mentioned the nights she'd stayed up helping him with school projects, the weekends she'd driven him to activities and games, the way she'd celebrated every achievement and comforted him through every disappointment. In Michael's revised history, Susie had been a burden he'd overcome rather than a mother who'd devoted her life to ensuring his success. The shift had become more pronounced after Michael's promotion to senior associate at his firm. He'd started making more money and had developed expensive tastes and strong opinions about things like wine and restaurants and vacation destinations. He'd begun treating Susie like she was somehow beneath him, speaking to her with a condescending patience that made her feel stupid and small. When she'd tried to share her own professional achievements with him, he'd listen with half attention and then change the subject to his own work, his own challenges, his own successes. Susie had started to feel like a supporting character in her own son's life, valued only for what she could provide, rather than for who she was as a person. The last few years had been particularly difficult. Michael had started canceling plans at the last minute, forgetting her birthday, and making excuses to avoid spending holidays with her. When he did visit, he seemed impatient and distracted, checking his phone constantly and making comments about how boring their small city was, compared to Chicago. Susie had tried to bridge the gap by visiting him in the city, but those trips had been awkward and uncomfortable. Michael would take her to expensive restaurants where she felt out of place, introduce her to his friends as "my mom from back home," in a tone that suggested she was an amusing curiosity rather than someone important to him. She'd started to wonder if she'd failed somehow as a mother, if she'd loved him too much or not enough or in the wrong way. She'd replayed conversations and interactions, looking for clues about where things had gone wrong, but she couldn't identify a specific moment when her loving, grateful son had become this stranger who seemed to barely tolerate her existence. The breaking point had come 3 months before the shelter incident, during what was supposed to be a pleasant weekend visit. Michael had called on a Friday afternoon, saying he had a work conference in their city and asking if he could stay at her house for the weekend rather than paying for a hotel. Susie had been thrilled, spending hours preparing his old room and planning meals she knew he'd enjoy. She'd taken time off work to spend with him and had mentally cataloged all the things she wanted to share with him about her business and her life. But the weekend had been a disaster from the moment he'd arrived. Michael had been in a bad mood, complaining about traffic and about having to work on a Saturday. He'd criticized everything from the coffee she'd made to the way she'd decorated the house, making cutting remarks about her suburban mom aesthetic and her basic furniture choices. When she'd tried to tell him about a major client she'd just landed, he'd interrupted to take a phone call that lasted 45 minutes. When she'd suggested they go to the farmer's market together like they used to, he'd rolled his eyes and said he didn't have time for that kind of thing anymore. The final blow had come Sunday morning when Susie had made his favorite breakfast and tried one more time to have a real conversation with him. She'd asked about his work, his relationships, his plans for the future, genuinely wanting to understand what was going on in his life. Michael had looked at her with unconcealed irritation and said, "Mom, you really need to get a life. I can't be your whole world anymore. It's weird and it's exhausting." The words had hit Susie like a physical blow. She'd stared at him across the kitchen table, this man she'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and realized that he genuinely believed she was pathetic, that her love for him was something embarrassing rather than precious, that her interest in his life was burdensome rather than caring. She'd excused herself to go to the bathroom and had cried silently for 10 minutes, trying to understand when caring about your child had become a character flaw. When she'd returned to the kitchen, Michael had been loading his bags into his car, eager to escape back to his important life in the city. "Thanks for letting me crash," he'd said casually, as if he'd done her a favor by staying in her home and eating her food and accepting her hospitality. "I'll try to visit again soon." But he hadn't visited again. He'd barely called. And when he'd finally contacted her 6 weeks later, it had been to execute his cruel joke at the homeless shelter. Now, lying on a thin mattress in a room full of women who had real problems and genuine need, Susie finally understood that the son she'd raised and loved no longer existed. In his place was a stranger who viewed her as entertainment, as someone so unimportant that her humiliation could be a source of amusement. The realization didn't bring anger, not yet. It brought a deep, aching sadness for the relationship she'd thought they had and the man she'd hoped he would become. But underneath the sadness, something else was stirring. A recognition that Michael's perception of her wasn't just wrong, it was dangerously misinformed. He thought she was weak, dependent, someone who existed solely in relation to him. He had no idea who she really was or what she'd accomplished. He'd been so focused on escaping what he saw as her limitations that he'd never bothered to see her strengths. As Susie finally drifted off to sleep in that uncomfortable bed, surrounded by the quiet breathing of women who were fighting real battles for survival, she made a decision that would change everything. It was time for Michael to learn exactly who his mother was, and it was time for her to stop protecting him from the consequences of his own cruelty. The education was about to begin, and the tuition was going to be higher than he'd ever imagined. The morning light, filtering through the shelter's barred windows, felt different than any sunrise Susie had ever experienced. She'd spent the night listening to stories that broke her heart and opened her eyes in ways she'd never expected. Maria, the woman in the cot next to hers, had fled an abusive husband with nothing but the clothes on her back and her 2-year-old daughter. Jennifer, across the room, had aged out of foster care at 18 and been living on the streets for 3 months, trying to save enough money for a security deposit on an apartment while working 2 minimum-wage jobs. These women were fighting real battles, facing genuine hardships, struggling against circumstances that were largely beyond their control. And here was Susie, someone who owned property worth more than most people made in a decade, sleeping among them because her son thought her fear and confusion were amusing. The intake coordinator, Linda, approached her during the morning meal distribution. "Mrs. Walker, I need to ask you a few questions for our records. Do you have somewhere to go today, or will you be needing extended services?" Susie looked around the room at the women who would be staying, who had nowhere else to turn, no resources to fall back on. The guilt sat heavy in her stomach. "I have somewhere to go," she said quietly. "This was just temporary." Linda nodded, but her eyes were kind and knowing. "Sometimes temporary situations teach us things we needed to learn. You're welcome back if you ever need us, but I have a feeling you're going to be just fine." Susie called a taxi from the shelter's lobby, refusing the coordinator's offer to help her contact family members. As she waited on the front steps, clutching the plastic bag Michael had given her, she felt something crystallizing in her chest. Not anger, not yet, but a cold, clear understanding of exactly what had happened and what it meant. The taxi driver, an older gentleman with tired eyes, glanced at her in the rearview mirror as they pulled away from the shelter. "Rough night?" he asked gently. "You could say that," Susie replied, "but I think it might have been exactly what I needed." The ride to her house on Elm Street took only 15 minutes, but it felt like traveling between 2 different worlds. From the harsh fluorescent lights and industrial carpeting of the shelter to her tree-lined neighborhood with its well-maintained lawns and flower beds. From the sound of women crying softly in the night to the quiet hum of her central air conditioning and the familiar creak of her front door. Susie stood in her foyer, looking around at the home she'd built with her own hands and her own money, and felt the first spark of something that would grow into a fire over the coming weeks. Michael thought she was nothing. He thought she was weak, dependent, someone who existed at his mercy. He had no idea what he'd just awakened. She walked through her house slowly, seeing it with new eyes. The hardwood floors she'd refinished herself during long weekends when Michael was too busy to visit. The kitchen she'd gutted and rebuilt, learning plumbing and electrical work from YouTube videos because she couldn't afford contractors. The home office where she'd built a business that now generated more revenue than Michael's prestigious firm's salary. In her office, Susie sat down at her computer and opened the files she hadn't looked at in months. Financial statements, investment, portfolios, property deeds, business valuations. Numbers that told a story Michael had never bothered to learn. Her consulting business wasn't just successful, it was thriving. Her investments weren't just stable, they were growing. Her net worth wasn't just comfortable, it was substantial. Susie pulled out a legal pad and began making calculations, adding up assets she'd accumulated through years of careful planning and smart decisions. The house, fully paid off, appraised at $450,000 last year. The Business, with its steady client base and strong reputation, worth at least $600,000 if she ever decided to sell. Investment accounts totaling over $800,000. The small apartment building she'd purchased as a rental property 3 years ago, now worth $300,000 and generating steady monthly income. The numbers added up to more than $2 million in assets, built quietly and carefully over the course of 15 years. Money Michael knew nothing about because he'd never asked about her financial situation beyond whether she could afford to help him with something. Susie leaned back in her chair, looking at the figures she'd written down. She'd built this wealth not for herself, but for Michael's future. She'd always imagined that someday she'd be able to help him buy his first house, start his own business, provide for his children. She'd dreamed of being the kind of grandmother who could pay for college educations and family vacations, who could leave a legacy that would benefit generations. But Michael didn't see her as someone capable of providing anything valuable. He saw her as a burden, an embarrassment, someone whose feelings could be trampled for his amusement. He'd made that crystal clear when he'd driven away from the shelter, laughing at her shock and fear. Susie picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for James Patterson, the estate planning attorney who'd helped her set up her will 5 years ago. Michael was currently the sole beneficiary of everything she owned, inheriting her entire estate when she died. She'd updated the will regularly as her assets grew, always with the assumption that Michael would use his inheritance wisely and remember the woman who'd loved him enough to build it for him. That assumption, she now realized, had been catastrophically naive. "James, it's Susie Walker," she said when the attorney answered. "I need to schedule an appointment to make some changes to my estate planning documents. Significant changes." "Of course, Susie. Is everything all right? You sound a bit different." "Everything is becoming very clear," she replied. "How soon can you see me?" They scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon. Susie spent the rest of the day doing something she hadn't done in years, thinking about herself first. She took a long bath, cooked herself a proper meal, and sat in her garden reading a book she'd been meaning to get to for months. She didn't check her phone for messages from Michael. She didn't wonder if he was feeling guilty about the previous night. She didn't make excuses for his behavior or try to rationalize his cruelty. For the first time in 32 years, Susie Walker focused entirely on her own needs and feelings, and discovered that they mattered more than she'd remembered. The next morning, she drove to her office for the first time since the shelter incident. Her assistant, Rebecca, looked up with surprise when she walked in. "Mrs. Walker, I wasn't expecting you today. How was your weekend?" "Educational," Susie replied. "Rebecca, I need you to pull together some financial reports for me. I want a complete analysis of our business assets, client contracts, and projected earnings for the next 5 years. And I need it by tomorrow morning." Rebecca's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "Of course. Is this for a new client presentation?" "No," Susie said, settling at her desk and opening her laptop. "This is for me." The rest of the morning was spent in focused productivity. Susie reviewed client accounts, approved marketing strategies, and had a conference call with a potential new client who was looking to expand their operations internationally. Her mind felt sharper than it had in months, freed from the constant, low-level anxiety of wondering when Michael would call or whether he approved of her choices. During her lunch break, she made another call that had been weighing on her mind since the previous night. "St. Catherine's Emergency Shelter. This is Linda." "Linda, this is Susan Walker. I stayed there Sunday night." "Of course, I remember you. How are you doing, honey?" "I'm doing well, thank you. I wanted to ask about making a donation to the shelter. What would be most helpful?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's very generous of you, Mrs. Walker. We always need funding for basic supplies, food, and our job training programs. But honestly, what we need most is operational support. We're always struggling to keep the lights on and the building maintained. What would it cost to fully fund operations for a year? Susie asked. Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Walker, that would be, well, our annual operating budget is about $200,000. That's not the kind of amount most individuals can contribute. Send me the information, Susie said. I'd like to review your financial statements and see where I can help most effectively. Linda's voice was stunned. Of course. Are you sure? I'm very sure. The women I met there deserve better than uncertainty about whether their safe place will still exist next month. I'll be in touch. Susie hung up feeling lighter than she had in years. Money was meant to be used for things that mattered, and helping women who were genuinely in need mattered far more than preserving an inheritance for someone who thought her humiliation was entertainment. That afternoon's meeting with James, Patterson was illuminating in ways Susie hadn't expected. The attorney, a careful man in his 60s who'd known her for years, listened without interruption as she explained what had happened at the shelter and what she wanted to change. Susie, I have to ask, are you making these decisions in response to a temporary emotion, or have you thought this through carefully? James, I've been thinking about this for longer than I realized. What happened at the shelter just made it impossible to ignore anymore. She handed him the list she'd prepared, outlining her new wishes for her estate. The house would go to a housing nonprofit that helped single mothers find stable homes. The business would be sold, with proceeds divided between several charities focused on women's education and empowerment. Her investment accounts would fund scholarships for first-generation college students. The rental property would be donated to an organization that provided transitional housing for women leaving abusive situations. Michael would receive exactly what he'd earned through his treatment of her. Nothing. This is a complete restructuring, James said, reviewing her notes. Your son is currently set to inherit everything. Are you certain you want to eliminate his inheritance entirely? I'm certain, Susie replied. Michael has made it clear that he views me as someone whose feelings don't matter, whose dignity is expendable for his amusement. I won't reward that behavior with financial security he doesn't deserve and clearly doesn't need. James nodded. Slowly. What about a trust fund with conditions? Sometimes that can encourage behavioral changes while still providing some family security. No, Susie said firmly. Michael is 32 years old with a good job and no dependents. He doesn't need my money, and he certainly hasn't earned it. My assets will go to people who will use them to build better lives, not to someone who thinks abandoning his mother at a homeless shelter is funny. The attorney was quiet for a long moment, then began taking notes. We'll need to be very careful with the language to ensure these changes can't be contested. Have you considered whether you want to inform Michael of these changes now, or let him discover them after your death? Susie had been thinking about that question since the previous morning. I want him to know, not as a threat or an ultimatum, but as a consequence. He needs to understand that actions have results and that the people he hurts might not be as powerless as he assumes. When do you want to tell him? Soon, Susie said, but first I want these documents finalized. I want everything legally binding before he knows what's changed. James promised to have new documents drafted within a week, with a formal signing scheduled for the following Friday. As Susie drove home from his office, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. She wasn't acting out of spite or revenge, but out of clarity. Her money would go to people who needed it, and would use it well, not to someone who'd demonstrated such casual cruelty toward the person who'd given him everything. That evening, Susie did something she'd been avoiding for months. She blocked Michael's number from her phone. Not because she was angry, but because she was done being available for someone who only contacted her when he wanted something, or when he felt like amusing himself at her expense. The silence felt profound and peaceful. No more waiting for calls that rarely came. No more hoping for conversations that inevitably left her feeling diminished. No more walking on eggshells around someone who'd made it clear that her feelings were irrelevant. Instead, Susie spent the evening researching the organizations she planned to support with her estate. She read about single mothers who'd graduated from college because of scholarship programs, about women who'd escaped domestic violence because of transitional housing, about families who'd achieved stability because of affordable housing initiatives. These were the people who deserved her legacy, who would honor it by building better lives and helping others do the same. These were the people who understood that resources were precious and should be used to create positive change in the world. As she prepared for bed, Susie looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and saw someone she'd forgotten existed. Not Michael's disappointing mother or the woman who'd tried so hard to earn his approval. She saw Susan Walker, successful businesswoman, property owner, someone who'd built something meaningful with her life and was now going to ensure it continued making a difference long after she was gone. The transformation had begun, and there would be no going back. Over the next few days, Susie threw herself into her work with renewed energy. She took on 2 new clients, expanded her marketing strategy, and began exploring opportunities to grow her business into new markets. She also started making discreet inquiries about Michael's professional life, using her network of contacts to learn more about his career trajectory and financial situation. What she discovered was both illuminating and concerning. Michael was doing well at his firm, but he was also living well beyond his means. The luxury apartment, the expensive car, the frequent vacations and designer clothes he showcased on social media were all financed by credit and the assumption that he would eventually inherit his mother's assets. Several of her contacts mentioned that Michael had been quite open about his expectation of coming into significant money when his mother died. He'd apparently told colleagues that his mother was pretty well off, and that he'd be able to make some major life changes once he inherited her estate. The casualness with which he discussed her death and his financial benefit from it was chilling. Michael wasn't just expecting to inherit her money, he was counting on it, planning around it, using the promise of it to justify a lifestyle he couldn't actually afford. Susie realized that the shelter incident hadn't been an isolated moment of cruelty. It was part of a larger pattern of viewing her as a resource rather than a person, someone whose primary value was what she could provide him rather than who she was as an individual. The revelation strengthened her resolve. Michael needed to learn that people weren't assets to be managed and exploited. He needed to understand that relationships required respect and care, not just expectation and entitlement. And he needed to face the consequences of treating someone who loved him as if her feelings were irrelevant. On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after the shelter incident, Susie's doorbell rang. She looked through the peephole and saw Michael, standing on her front porch, holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers, and wearing the expression he'd perfected as a child when he'd broken something and wanted to avoid punishment. Susie took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. It was time for her son to meet the woman he'd never bothered to really know. Michael stood on the porch holding wilted carnations from the grocery store clearance rack, his smile bright and practiced. He was wearing his most charming expression, the one that had gotten him out of trouble countless times throughout his childhood. But something in Susie's face made him shift uncomfortably, though he couldn't quite identify what had changed. "Hey, Mom," he said, leaning in for a hug that felt more like a transaction than an embrace. "I brought you flowers. I know last week was a little intense, and I wanted to make sure you're okay." Susie accepted the flowers without enthusiasm, noting how he'd framed the shelter incident as something that had simply happened rather than something he'd deliberately orchestrated. A little intense, as if abandoning your mother at a homeless shelter was comparable to a minor disagreement about dinner plans. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him pass. "Though I'm surprised you're here. I would have thought you'd be too busy with your important life in the city." Michael laughed, missing the edge in her voice entirely. "You know I always have time for you, Mom. Besides, I was in the area for work again." He settled himself on her couch as if he owned it, spreading out comfortably and immediately reaching for the remote control. Man, I'm exhausted. This week has been absolutely brutal at the firm. Susie remained standing, watching him make himself at home in her space without invitation or consideration. Would you like something to drink? She asked, though her tone suggested it was more obligation than hospitality. Coffee would be great. You know how I like it. Michael was already flipping through channels, his attention focused on the television rather than the woman who'd raised him. Oh, and do you have any of those cookies you used to make, the chocolate chip ones? I've been craving them all week. Susie walked to the kitchen, noting how easily Michael had slipped into his familiar role of the visiting prince, expecting service and comfort without offering anything in return. She made coffee, but she didn't bake cookies. Instead, she used the time to center herself, to remember who she was now and what she'd learned about her son over the past week. When she returned to the living room, Michael was scrolling through his phone while the television played in the background. He looked up briefly as she set down his coffee mug, then immediately returned to his screen. So, I've been thinking, he said, not bothering to thank her for the coffee. That whole thing last week got pretty out of hand. I mean, I know you were upset, but you have to admit it was kind of funny, right? You should have seen your face when you realized what was happening. Susie sat down across from him, studying his expression. There was no remorse there, no genuine concern for how his actions had affected her. If anything, he seemed amused by the memory, as if he were recounting a practical joke he'd played on a stranger rather than describing how he'd humiliated his own mother. Funny, she repeated slowly. You think terrorizing a 60-year-old woman by abandoning her at a homeless shelter is funny? Michael waved his hand dismissively. Come on, Mom, don't be so dramatic. You weren't actually in any danger. It's not like I left you on the street corner. The shelter is a safe place and you only had to stay one night. It was just a wake-up call, you know, to help you appreciate what you have. A wake-up call, Susie said, keeping her voice level. And what exactly did you think I needed to wake up from? Well, you know how you get sometimes. All clingy and emotional, making everything about you. I thought maybe if you experienced what real hardship looked like, you'd stop being so needy all the time. Michael took a sip of his coffee and made a face. This tastes different. Did you change brands? Susie ignored the question about the coffee. Needy? She said. You think caring about my son makes me needy. I mean, yeah, kind of. You call too much, you want to know every detail about my life, you get hurt when I can't visit every weekend. It's a lot, Mom. I have my own life to live. And I can't constantly worry about managing your emotions. The casual cruelty of his words hit Susie like a physical blow, but she'd spent the past week preparing for this conversation. She'd known that Michael would try to justify his behavior, to make her feel like she'd somehow deserved what he'd done to her. She'd also known that his justification would reveal exactly how he really viewed their relationship. Managing my emotions, she repeated. Is that what you think a relationship with your mother should be? Management? Michael sighed, the sound heavy with exaggerated patience. Look, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings here. I'm just being honest. You've built your whole life around me, and that's not healthy for either of us. You need to find your own identity, your own interests, maybe get a hobby or something. Susie almost laughed at the irony. Here was her son, who knew nothing about her business success, her financial independence, or her charitable interests, telling her she needed to find her own identity. He was so convinced of her emptiness that he couldn't see the full life she'd built right in front of him. You think I don't have my own identity, she said. Well, do you? I mean, what do you do all day when you're not working your little consulting thing? You spend most of your time thinking about me, don't you? Wondering when I'm going to call, planning what you'll say when I visit, worrying about whether I'm eating enough or working too hard. Michael leaned forward, his expression earnest. That's not a life, Mom. That's just existing in relation to someone else. The accuracy of his assumptions about her old patterns was startling, even though those patterns had changed dramatically over the past week. Michael was describing the woman she used to be, the mother who had indeed organized her world around his needs and availability. But he was speaking as if that dynamic was inherent and permanent, rather than something that could evolve and change. "And what do you think would be a better life for me?" Susie asked. Michael brightened, apparently relieved that she was receptive to his guidance. "Well, you could travel more. Take those art classes you used to talk about. Maybe join a book club or volunteer somewhere. There are lots of things people your age do to stay busy." People your age, as if she were ancient and irrelevant rather than 60 and in her prime. As if the activities he was suggesting were meant to occupy her time rather than fulfill her spirit. He was essentially recommending that she find ways to distract herself from bothering him, not encouraging her to pursue meaningful goals. "Volunteer somewhere," she said thoughtfully. "That's an interesting suggestion." "Exactly. You could help out at the library, or maybe that animal shelter downtown. Something that would give you a sense of purpose without being too demanding." Michael seemed pleased with his problem-solving. "And then, when I visit, we could talk about your volunteer work instead of you always asking about my job and my relationships." Susie realized that Michael wanted her to become a different kind of prop in his life. Not the needy, emotional mother who required management, but the busy, fulfilled mother who would provide interesting conversation without demanding too much attention. He wanted her to transform herself into someone more convenient for him, someone whose needs wouldn't interfere with his comfort. "You've really thought this through," she said. "I have. And I think the shelter thing, as unfortunate as it was, might actually be a good starting point. Like, now you know what real problems look like, so hopefully you won't get so worked up about small stuff anymore." Michael reached over and patted her hand in a way that felt patronizing rather than affectionate. "I just want you to be happy, Mom. And I think you'll be happier when you're not so focused on me all the time." Susie looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. This wasn't the little boy who used to help her study for her business classes. This wasn't the teenager who'd been proud of her promotions at work. This was a man who viewed her as a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be loved. "Michael," she said carefully, "tell me something. When you think about me, about who I am as a person, what comes to mind?" He looked puzzled by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if someone asked you to describe your mother, not just as your mother but as an individual human being, what would you say?" Michael was quiet for a moment, apparently struggling with the concept. "Well, you're caring, sometimes too. Much, but that's not necessarily bad. You're reliable. You've always been there when I needed something. You're good at organizing things and keeping track of details." He paused, thinking. "I guess you're pretty smart about some things, though. You don't always think things through before you react emotionally." Susie absorbed his assessment, noting how every positive trait he'd mentioned was in relation to how she served him or others. Caring, reliable, good at organizing. He saw her as a collection of useful functions rather than a whole person with her own dreams, ambitions, and achievements. "Is there anything about me that doesn't relate to taking care of other people?" she asked. Michael looked genuinely confused. "I don't understand what you're asking. I'm asking whether you see me as a person who exists independently of my relationships, whether you think I have value beyond what I provide to other people." "Of course you do," Michael said quickly, though his expression suggested he'd never actually considered the question before. "I mean, everyone has value. You're a good person, Mom. You just need to find ways to apply that goodness to a wider circle instead of focusing so much on me." Again, his solution involved her redirecting her energy toward serving others rather than developing herself. He couldn't conceive of her having ambitions or interests that weren't centered on caretaking, because he'd never bothered to learn about the parts of her life that didn't involve him. Susie stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden she'd designed and planted herself. "Michael, how much do you think this house is worth?" He glanced around the living room, taking in the furniture and decor with the casual assessment of someone who'd never been personally responsible for acquiring any of it. "I don't know, maybe 150, 175. It's a nice house, but it's not exactly luxury. Why?" His estimate was off by nearly $300,000, but Susie wasn't surprised. Michael had never asked about her financial situation beyond whether she could afford to help him with something. He'd assumed that because she lived modestly and didn't flaunt wealth, she must not have any. "Just curious," she said. "What about my business? How do you think that's going?" "It's fine, I guess. I mean, you seem to stay busy with it and you're able to pay your bills. It's not like you're getting rich off it, but it's a nice little income for someone your age." Michael's tone was indulgent, as if he were praising a child's lemonade stand. "I'm proud of you for keeping yourself occupied with it." Occupied, as if her successful consulting business was a hobby designed to fill her empty hours rather than a legitimate career that generated substantial income. Michael had no idea that her nice little income was actually significantly higher than his own salary, or that her client list included companies he'd recognize and respect. "You're proud of me for keeping myself occupied," Susie repeated. "Well, yeah. I know it can't be easy to find meaningful work at your stage of life, so I think it's great that you've found something that makes you feel useful." Michael smiled at her as if he'd just given her a wonderful compliment. "Not everyone your age is able to adapt to the modern business world the way you have." Susie turned back to face him, feeling a clarity that was both painful and liberating. Her son didn't just underestimate her. He had no idea who she was at all. He'd constructed an entire narrative about her life based on assumptions and stereotypes, rather than curiosity or genuine interest. In his mind, she was a lonely older woman with a small consulting business that helped her feel important, living in a modest house and organizing her life around his occasional visits. The real Susan Walker, the one who'd built a multi-million-dollar estate through intelligence and hard work, might as well have been invisible to him. "Michael," she said, settling back into her chair, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "Okay," he said, though he was already reaching for his phone again. "Put the phone down," she said firmly. He looked surprised by her tone but complied, setting the device on the coffee table. "What's going on, Mom? You're acting kind of weird. I want you to tell me what you're planning to do with your inheritance when I die." Michael's expression shifted, becoming uncomfortable and slightly guilty. "That's a weird thing to ask about." "Is it? You're 32 years old and I'm 60. It's not unreasonable to discuss estate planning. I'm asking what your plans are for the money you expect to inherit." "I don't really think about it," Michael said, but his face was reddening slightly. "I mean, obviously I hope you live for a very long time. I'm not sitting around waiting for you to die or anything." Susie waited, maintaining eye contact, until Michael's discomfort forced him to continue. "I guess when the time comes, I'd probably use some of it to pay off my student loans and maybe upgrade my living situation. Nothing extravagant, just normal stuff." He was speaking carefully now, as if he were navigating dangerous territory. "Is there a reason you're asking about this?" "I'm curious about what you think you'll be inheriting," Susie said. "How much money do you expect to receive?" Michael shifted in his seat, clearly wishing this conversation would end. "I don't know, Mom. I've never really thought about specific numbers. Whatever you leave me, I'll be grateful for. But you must have some idea. You've made comments to your colleagues about coming into money when I die. You've planned financial decisions around the assumption that you'll inherit my assets. Surely you have some estimate of what those assets might be worth." Michael's face went pale. "I don't know who told you that, but I've never discussed your personal business with my colleagues. That would be completely inappropriate. Susie smiled, recognizing the deflection tactic he'd perfected as a teenager. When caught in questionable behavior, deny the specific accusation while ignoring the larger issue. So, you're saying you've never mentioned to anyone at work that you expect to inherit money from me? I might have mentioned that you're financially stable, but only in the context of explaining why I don't worry about you being able to take care of yourself. It wasn't about inheritance or anything like that. The lie came so easily that Susie wondered how many other things Michael had misrepresented. Over the years, she had detailed information about his conversations with colleagues, provided by contacts who were concerned about his casual attitude toward her death and his financial benefit from it. "Michael," she said quietly, "I want you to understand something very clearly. The person you described earlier, the needy woman with no identity beyond her relationship with her son, the one who needs to find hobbies to fill her empty life, that person doesn't exist." "What do you mean?" "I mean you don't know me at all. You've created a fictional version of me based on your own assumptions and convenience, and you've been relating to that fiction rather than to the actual person I am." Susie leaned forward, her voice gaining strength. "The woman you abandoned at a homeless shelter last week isn't the pathetic dependent you think she is. She's someone you've never bothered to really see or understand." Michael looked, genuinely confused. "Mom, I think you're overreacting again. I know you better than anyone. We've lived together for 18 years, and we've been close ever since." "Close," Susie said. "When was the last time you asked me a question about my life that wasn't related to logistics or whether I could help you with something?" "I ask about your life all the time." "You ask whether I'm okay, whether I need anything, whether I'm keeping busy? You don't ask about my goals, my challenges, my successes, or my interests beyond how they affect you." Susie stood up again, needing the physical height to match the emotional strength she was building. "You don't know what I've accomplished, what I own, what I've built, or what I'm capable of because you've never been curious enough to find out." Michael was starting to look annoyed. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Mom. You're turning a simple conversation into some big, emotional drama. I do know you, and I do care about your life. Just because I don't interrogate you about every detail doesn't mean I don't love you. But you think it's appropriate to interrogate me about whether I deserve basic human dignity?" Susie said. "You think it's reasonable to terrorize me as a teaching tool. You think my feelings are something that need to be managed rather than respected. I think your feelings sometimes get out of proportion to the actual situation," Michael said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "And I think this is one of those times. I made a mistake last week, I apologized with flowers, and now you're acting like I committed some unforgivable crime." Susie realized that this conversation was never going to reach the resolution she'd hoped for. Michael was too invested in his narrative about her, too comfortable with his role as the long-suffering son managing his difficult mother. He wasn't capable of seeing her as anything other than what he needed her to be. But that was all right. She didn't need his understanding or his recognition. She just needed him to know that consequences were coming, and that the woman he'd underestimated was about to change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. "You're right," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I am making this more complicated than it needs to be. Let's keep it simple. Would you like to have dinner? I was thinking of ordering pizza." Michael's relief was visible. "That sounds great. You know what I like." "Yes," Susie said, reaching for her phone. "I know exactly what you like. The question is whether you've earned it." But she ordered the pizza anyway, and they spent the next hour eating in relative peace while Michael talked about his work and his social life, apparently convinced that he'd successfully managed another one of his mother's emotional episodes. He had no idea that he'd just sealed his own fate, or that the woman serving him dinner was quietly planning the most expensive lesson of his life. The following Monday morning, Susie sat in James Patterson's office signing the final documents that would reshape her legacy completely. The new will was comprehensive and irrevocable, directing every penny of her substantial estate away from Michael and toward organizations that would use her money to genuinely help people in need. "These changes are now legally binding," James said, sliding the documents into a secure folder. "Are you certain you don't want to reconsider any provision for your son, even a small trust fund with behavioral conditions?" Susie's hand was steady as she signed the last page. "I'm absolutely certain. Michael has demonstrated that he views me as entertainment rather than family. He'll receive exactly what that relationship is worth." James nodded, though she could see the concern in his eyes. "What's your timeline for informing him of these changes?" "Soon," Susie replied. "But first I want him to fully understand who he's been dismissing all these years. He needs to see the scope of what he's lost before he learns that he's lost it." That afternoon, Susie began implementing the first phase of her plan. She called Rebecca into her office and closed the door, settling behind her desk with the focused energy of someone about to launch a campaign. "Rebecca, I need you to help me with a rather unusual project. I want to create a comprehensive portfolio documenting the full scope of Walker Consulting Solutions. Financial statements, client testimonials, industry recognition, growth projections, everything that demonstrates the true value and success of what we've built here." Rebecca's eyebrows rose with interest. "Are you considering selling the business?" "In a manner of speaking," Susie said. "I'm also going to need detailed documentation of my personal assets, property valuations, investment portfolios, the works, and I want it all presented in a format that would be clear to someone with no business background." "That's quite a comprehensive request. When do you need this completed?" "By Friday." "I know it's a tight timeline, but this is extremely important." Rebecca gathered her notes and headed for the door, then paused. "Mrs. Walker, if you don't mind me asking, is everything all right? You've seemed different since last week. More focused, but also more distant." Susie considered how much to share, then decided honesty was the best approach. "I've recently learned some difficult truths about someone very close to me. Someone who I thought knew and valued me, but who actually has no idea who I am or what I've accomplished. I'm in the process of correcting that misunderstanding." "Family?" Rebecca asked gently. "My son." Rebecca's expression softened with understanding. "I have a daughter who went through a phase of thinking she knew everything about me and my limitations. It took some very clear demonstrations of my actual capabilities to shift her perspective." "What did you do?" "I stopped making her life easier and started letting her see me as I really am, rather than as the version of me that was most convenient for her." Rebecca smiled. "It was uncomfortable at first, but our relationship is much stronger now because it's based on reality rather than her assumptions." Susie felt a surge of validation. "That's exactly what I'm hoping to achieve." Over the next few days, Susie watched the portfolio come together with a sense of satisfaction she hadn't expected. Seeing her accomplishments documented so thoroughly was revelatory even for her. The business she'd built from her dining room table was now valued at over $600,000. Her investment strategy had generated returns that placed her in the top 5% of individual investors in her age bracket. Her property holdings had appreciated significantly beyond her original projections. On paper, Susan Walker was an undeniably successful entrepreneur and investor, someone who'd built substantial wealth through intelligence, hard work, and strategic thinking. The portfolio told the story of a woman who'd overcome single motherhood, limited resources, and societal expectations to create a legacy that would benefit others for generations. It was exactly the opposite of the story Michael had constructed about her life. While Rebecca assembled the business documentation, Susie began her own research project. She wanted to understand exactly how Michael had been living and what his true financial situation looked like. the information she gathered was both enlightening and concerning. Michael's lifestyle was funded entirely by credit and the assumption of future inheritance. His luxury apartment cost more per month than most people earned. His car payments, insurance, and maintenance expenses consumed nearly a quarter of his salary. His spending on clothes, restaurants, and entertainment suggested someone with twice his actual income. Even more troubling was the pattern of financial commitments he'd made based on his expected inheritance. He'd co-signed a loan for a friend's business venture, apparently confident that he'd be able to cover any shortfalls with his mother's money. He'd also made verbal commitments to contribute to his girlfriend's graduate school expenses, again assuming he'd have access to substantial funds within the next few years. Michael had essentially borrowed against his anticipated inheritance to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford on his own merits. The irony was devastating. He'd dismissed his mother as financially insignificant while simultaneously planning his entire future around the money she'd earned through her own efforts. Susie also discovered that Michael had been less than truthful about his professional standing. While he was indeed employed at a prestigious firm, his performance reviews were mediocre and his advancement prospects were limited. Several colleagues had noted his tendency to overpromise and underdeliver, his difficulty accepting feedback, and his habit of taking credit for team successes while deflecting responsibility for failures. The picture that emerged was of a young man living in a fantasy world, supported by credit and false expectations, with limited actual skills or accountability. He'd been coasting on potential and assumptions rather than building real competence or value. On Thursday evening, Michael called unexpectedly, his voice bright with excitement. "Mom, I have incredible news. I just got invited to present a proposal to one of the biggest potential clients our firm has ever pursued. If I land this account, it could be career-changing." Susie listened to his enthusiasm with mixed emotions. Part of her wanted to celebrate his opportunity, but she couldn't ignore the underlying pattern of entitlement and grandiosity that colored everything he did. "That sounds like a significant opportunity," she said carefully. "What makes you confident you'll be successful?" "Well, the client is looking for someone who really understands their industry and can think strategically about their challenges. I've been studying their business model for weeks, and I think I have some insights that could really make a difference." Michael's excitement was infectious despite everything. "The only downside is that if I get the account, I'll probably need to invest in some better presentation materials and maybe upgrade my wardrobe. First impressions matter in this business." "And how do you plan to fund these upgrades?" Susie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Well, I was hoping maybe you could help me out with a loan. Nothing major, maybe $5,000 or $6,000? I know it seems like a lot, but this could really be my big break. And obviously, I'd pay you back as soon as the commission checks start coming in." Susie felt a familiar tug of maternal instinct, the urge to support her son's dreams and smooth his path toward success. But she also recognized the pattern that had been established over years of similar requests. Michael would ask for help funding his ambitions, she would provide it, and then the success he'd promised would either fail to materialize, or he'd find new expenses that prevented him from repaying her. "Michael," she said slowly, "how much money do you think I have available to lend you?" He was quiet for a moment, apparently calculating. "I don't know exactly, but I figured you probably have some savings put aside. Maybe not a lot, but enough to help me out with something this important." "Some savings," she repeated. "And what if this opportunity doesn't work out the way you're hoping? What if you can't pay me back?" "It will work out," Michael said confidently. "This is exactly the kind of break I've been waiting for. Besides, even if it takes longer than expected to pay you back, it's not like you need the money right away, right? You're pretty set with your little business and everything." Your little business. Even when asking for her financial help, Michael couldn't resist diminishing her professional accomplishments. He saw her as a convenient source of emergency funding rather than a successful entrepreneur who'd earned her money through skill and effort. "I'll think about it," Susie said. "Can you send me more details about this opportunity? I'd like to understand exactly what you're proposing before I make any financial commitments." "Of course. I'll email you everything tonight. Thanks, Mom. I knew I could count on you." After he hung up, Susie sat in her kitchen feeling the weight of 32 years of enabling and sacrifice. How many times had she said yes to Michael's requests without asking hard questions? How many times had she provided financial support without requiring accountability or even basic gratitude? She'd thought she was being a good mother by making his life easier, but she'd actually been preventing him from developing the skills and character he needed to succeed on his own. Her generosity had become a crutch that kept him from learning to walk independently. The next morning, Rebecca presented Susie with the completed portfolio, a leather-bound document that told the comprehensive story of her business and personal financial success. The numbers were impressive even to Susie, who'd lived through every step of the journey. "This is remarkable work," she said, flipping through pages of charts and testimonials. "You've captured everything perfectly. I have to admit, putting this together made me see you in a new light," Rebecca said. "I knew you were successful, but I didn't realize the full scope of what you've accomplished. This portfolio documents the achievements of someone who should be featured in business magazines and invited to speak at entrepreneurship conferences." Susie smiled. "Maybe that's something to consider for the future. Right now, though, I have a more immediate use for this documentation." That afternoon, Susie drove to Michael's office building in downtown Chicago. She'd never visited him at work before, partly because he'd never invited her, and partly because she'd sensed he preferred to keep his professional and personal lives separate. But today, she wanted to see the environment where he'd built his identity as someone important and successful. The lobby was impressive, all marble and steel and floor-to-ceiling windows. Susie announced herself to the receptionist and waited. In a seating area surrounded by awards and photos showcasing the firm's achievements and prestigious clients. When Michael appeared, he looked surprised and slightly uncomfortable. "Mom, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" "Everything is fine," she said, standing to greet him. "I wanted to bring you something, and I thought it would be nice to see where you work." "Oh, okay. Well, this is the lobby. Pretty standard office building." Michael glanced around nervously as if he were worried about being seen with her. "What did you want to bring me?" Susie handed him a manila envelope. "The information you requested about my financial situation. Since you're asking me to lend you money, I thought you should understand exactly what you're asking for." Michael took the envelope but didn't open it. "Thanks, but you didn't have to come all the way down here. You could have just mailed it or brought it by the house this weekend." "I wanted to meet your colleagues," Susie said. "You've told them so much about me. I thought it was time we were properly introduced." Michael's face went pale. "I haven't really talked about you that much. And everyone's pretty busy right now." "I'm sure they can spare a few minutes, especially since some of them are so interested in my estate planning." Susie smiled pleasantly. "Why don't you introduce me to whoever's available?" "Mom, this really isn't a good time. I have meetings all afternoon and I don't want to bother people." Michael was speaking quietly now, his discomfort obvious. "Maybe we could do this another time." "Oh, I think now is perfect," Susie said, her voice carrying just enough edge to make it clear she wasn't going to be dissuaded. "I'll only take a few minutes of their time. I'm sure they'll find it educational." Michael looked trapped, glancing between his mother and the elevator that led to his floor. Finally, he sighed in resignation. "Okay, but just for a minute. And please don't embarrass me." As they rode the elevator up to his floor, Susie reflected on how the dynamics between them had already shifted. For the first time in years, Michael was the one who was nervous and uncertain while she felt calm and in control. It was a small preview of the larger reversal that was coming. The office was exactly what she'd expected: modern, expensive, designed to impress clients and reinforce the status of the people who worked there. Michael led her through a maze of cubicles and glass-walled offices, clearly hoping to make their visit as brief and unobtrusive as possible. "Michael," a voice called out from across the room, "is this the famous mother we've heard so much about?" A man in his 30s approached them, extending his hand with a broad smile. "I'm David Chen, one of Michael's colleagues. We've heard wonderful things about you." Susie shook his hand warmly. "How lovely to meet you, David. I hope Michael hasn't been boring you with too many stories about his boring old mother." "Not at all. Actually, he's told us you're quite well off. Lucky guy, having a mother who can help out when needed." David's smile was friendly but calculating, the expression of someone who saw relationships in terms of potential advantage. "Well off," Susie repeated, glancing at Michael, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "What exactly has Michael told you about my financial situation?" David laughed. "Oh, you know how it is. He mentioned that you've done well for yourself and that he's not worried about his future security. We're all a little jealous, honestly. Not many of us have that kind of family safety net." "Family safety net," Susie said thoughtfully. "Michael, you've been discussing my money with your co-workers?" "It wasn't like that," Michael said quickly. "I just mentioned that you're financially stable. It came up in conversation about retirement, planning, and family support. It wasn't anything inappropriate." "Of course not," David said, apparently oblivious to the tension in the air. "We were talking about long-term financial planning, and Michael mentioned that he'll be inheriting a substantial estate eventually. Smart thinking, really, factoring family assets into your retirement calculations." Susie smiled, but there was steel behind it. "Substantial estate. That's interesting. Michael, what gave you the impression that my estate was substantial?" Michael was now visibly sweating. "I don't know. I just assumed. I mean, you own your house and you have your business. I never said it was huge or anything." "Actually," another voice chimed in, "you said your mother was worth at least a couple million and that you wouldn't have to worry about money once you inherited it all." Susie turned to see a young woman approaching them, apparently unaware that she'd just detonated a bomb in the middle of the conversation. "I'm Sarah Martinez," she said, extending her hand. "I sit next to Michael. He's shown us pictures of your beautiful house." "Sarah," Michael hissed, his face now completely red. "What? I'm just saying it's nice that he has such a successful mother. Not everyone is lucky enough to have that kind of inheritance waiting for them." Sarah looked confused by Michael's obvious distress. "Did I say something wrong?" Susie felt a moment of genuine pity for Michael, watching him realize that his casual conversations about her money had been more revealing than he'd intended. But the pity was quickly replaced by anger as she understood the full scope of how he'd been using her as a financial credential among his peers. "Not at all, Sarah. I'm fascinated to learn how well Michael knows my financial situation." Susie reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "Since you all seem so interested in my success, perhaps you'd like to know more about how I built it." Sarah took the card and read it aloud. "Walker Consulting Solutions, Susan Walker, founder and CEO." She looked up with surprise. "This is a real company? I thought you just did some freelance work or something." "Oh no," Susie said, her voice gaining strength. "Walker Consulting Solutions is a multi-million-dollar business with an impressive client list and a track record of consistent growth and profitability. I started it from nothing 15 years ago, and it's now one of the most respected consulting firms in the region." David and Sarah exchanged glances, both clearly reassessing their assumptions about the woman in front of them. Michael looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. "That's incredible," David said. "Michael, you never mentioned that your mother ran a major consulting firm." "I wouldn't say major," Michael stammered, but Susie cut him off. Actually, you might want to open that envelope I gave you, Michael. It contains detailed documentation of exactly how major my business really is. She turned to his colleagues with a smile that was both gracious and dangerous. I thought it was time Michael learned the truth about what he stands to inherit from his boring old mother. Michael's hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope and pulled out the portfolio. Rebecca had prepared. His face went white as he flipped through the first few pages, taking in financial statements and property valuations that clearly far exceeded his wildest expectations. "This can't be right," he whispered, staring at the numbers in front of him. "Oh, it's completely accurate," Susie said cheerfully. "I had my accountant and my attorney verify every figure. Would you like to share the details with your friends? I'm sure they'd be interested to know exactly how substantial my estate really is." Michael looked up at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not embarrassment or discomfort, but something approaching fear. As if he was beginning to understand that the woman standing in front of him wasn't the person he'd thought he knew. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," he said, his voice barely audible. "Oh, I think your colleagues deserve to hear this," Susie replied. "After all, they've been so understanding about your financial planning strategies." "Different how?" Michael shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, obviously there's more money involved than I expected. Which is great, but also kind of overwhelming. I'd need to think about how to handle that level of financial responsibility." Susie noted how quickly he'd moved from shock to assumption. Even faced with evidence that he'd been completely wrong about her, Michael was already mentally spending money he hadn't earned and wasn't entitled to. The sense of ownership, of inevitable inheritance, was so deeply ingrained that he couldn't conceive of any other possibility. "Michael," she said gently, "I want you to pick up that document on the bottom of the stack, the one with the law firm letterhead." He found the document and began reading, his expression growing increasingly confused and then alarmed. "This is a will," he said. "Yes, it is. My new will, executed and filed last Monday." Michael's face went white as he read the provisions, each paragraph making it clear that his name appeared nowhere in the document, except in a single clause specifically disinheriting him. "This says you're leaving everything to charities. Everything." "That's correct. But this can't be legal. I'm your son. I have rights to your estate." "Actually, you don't," Susie said calmly. "I'm not legally required to leave you anything. Parents can disinherit their children for any reason or for no reason at all. I chose to disinherit you for a very specific reason." Michael stared at the document as if it might change if he read it enough times. "You're doing this because of the shelter thing, because I played a prank that went too far." "I'm doing this because of who you've revealed yourself to be," Susie corrected. The shelter incident wasn't an isolated mistake, Michael. It was the culmination of years of dismissive, disrespectful behavior. It was you demonstrating that you view my dignity and emotional well-being as expendable for your amusement. "I said I was sorry about that. I brought you flowers." "You brought me wilted flowers from the grocery store clearance rack and told me I was overreacting." Susie's voice hardened. "You showed no genuine remorse, no understanding of why what you did was cruel, and no interest in examining your own behavior. You blamed me for being too sensitive rather than acknowledging that you'd been deliberately hurtful." Michael set down the will with shaking hands. "So you're punishing me financially because you didn't like my apology?" "I'm protecting my legacy from someone who's demonstrated that he doesn't deserve it," Susie said. "Someone who's shown me that he values my resources but not my humanity. That's not fair. I do value you. You're my mother." "Am I? Or am I just a woman who raised you and funded your life, and is now expected to fund your future?" Susie leaned forward. "Tell me, Michael, what do you value about me specifically? Not what I've done for you or what I can provide, but who I am as a person." Michael opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He sat in silence for nearly a minute, apparently struggling to answer a question that should have been simple. "You're caring," he finally said, "and you've always been there for me." "Those are things I've done, not who I am. Try again. You're smart, I guess, and determined." "Better. What else?" "I don't know what you want me to say," Michael said, his frustration evident. "I don't understand what this proves." "It proves that you see me as a collection of services rather than as a complete human being with my own dreams, goals, and achievements," Susie said. "You can't describe who I am because you've never bothered to learn. You've been content to see me as mother, the woman who exists to support your life rather than live her own." Michael was quiet again, but this time Susie could see him actually thinking, processing her words rather than just waiting for his turn to defend himself. "I never thought about it that way," he said finally. "I know you didn't. That's exactly the problem. So what happens now? You cut me out of your will, forever, because I didn't ask the right questions about your business." "This isn't about my business, Michael. This is about 32 years of taking me for granted, culminating in you abandoning me at a homeless shelter because you thought it would be funny." Susie stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden she'd designed and planted. "You've been planning your financial future around my death, telling your colleagues about the money you expect to inherit, making spending decisions based on assets you haven't earned. That's not normal behavior for someone who loves and respects their parent." "I never planned around your death," Michael protested. "I just assumed that eventually, like with most families, there would be some inheritance. That's normal." "It would be normal if you had a normal relationship with your parent. If you treated me with respect and care, if you showed interest in my life beyond what I could do for you, if you didn't abandon me at homeless shelters for entertainment." Susie turned back to face him. "They should know what you're actually working with." She reached over and took the portfolio from his nerveless fingers, opening it to a page that showed her total net worth in clear, undeniable numbers. $2.3 million, she read aloud. "That's my current total asset value, not including the ongoing income from my business or the appreciation potential of my investment portfolio." The silence that followed was profound. David and Sarah stared at the numbers, then at Michael, then back at the numbers. Other colleagues had begun to gather around, drawn by the unusual scene playing out in their typically subdued workplace. "Michael," David said slowly, "you said your mother had some savings. You never mentioned she was a multimillionaire." "I didn't know," Michael said weakly, still staring at the portfolio. "She never told me any of this." "I wonder why that might be," Susie said, her voice carrying an edge that made everyone in the vicinity pay attention. "Perhaps because you never asked. Perhaps because you were too busy assuming you knew everything about my life to bother learning the actual facts." So, she closed the portfolio and tucked it back into the envelope, then smiled at the group of young professionals who were still processing what they'd just witnessed. "It's been lovely meeting you all," she said warmly. "I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Michael, I'll expect to hear from you soon. We have quite a lot to discuss." As she walked toward the elevator, Susie could hear the stunned whispers beginning behind her. Michael's carefully constructed image as the heir to a modest inheritance had just been demolished in front of his colleagues, replaced by the reality of a son who'd been so dismissive of his mother that he'd never bothered to learn she was worth more than most of them would earn in their entire careers. The elevator doors closed on Michael's shocked face, and Susie allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The education had begun, and the student was finally starting to understand how much he didn't know about his teacher. Michael didn't call that evening, or the next day, or the day after that. Susie wasn't surprised. She imagined him holed up, in his expensive apartment, poring over the financial documents she'd left with him, trying to reconcile the numbers with his assumptions about her life. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming. When he finally did call, 4 days after the office incident, His voice was different. Gone was the casual condescension, the easy confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. In its place was uncertainty, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Mom, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Yes, we do," Susie agreed. "Would you like to come here, or shall I come to you?" "I'll come there, tonight, if that's okay. I need to understand what's happening." Susie spent the afternoon preparing for what she knew would be the most important conversation of their relationship. She arranged the living room carefully, placing additional copies of her financial documents on the coffee table alongside the new will James Patterson had prepared. Everything Michael needed to understand his situation was laid out clearly and professionally. When he arrived, Michael looked like he hadn't slept well in days. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled, his confident demeanor replaced by nervous energy. He sat down heavily on the couch and stared at the documents spread before him. "Is this real?" he asked, picking up the business valuation report. "Are these numbers actually accurate?" "Completely accurate," Susie confirmed. "I had everything independently verified before I showed it to you. I wanted there to be no question about the facts." Michael shook his head slowly. "I don't understand how I didn't know about this. How did you hide all of this from me?" "I didn't hide anything, Michael. You never asked. In 32 years, you've never once inquired about the details of my financial situation beyond whether I could afford to help you with something." Susie settled into her chair across from him. "You assumed I was struggling because that assumption was convenient for you. It made you feel superior and justified your attitude toward me." "That's not true," Michael protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I always knew you were doing okay. I just didn't realize the scale of it. You told your colleagues I was worth maybe $100,000 or $200,000 total. You described my business as a little consulting thing that kept me busy. You estimated my house value at half of what it's actually worth." Susie's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "Those weren't casual underestimations, Michael. They were fundamental misunderstandings of who I am and what I've accomplished." Michael was quiet for a long moment, flipping through pages of financial statements and property appraisals. "Okay, so you're successful. More successful than I realized. That's good news, right? I mean, this is amazing for both of us." "Is it?" Susie asked. "Tell me why you think my financial success is good news for you." "Well, because—" Michael paused, apparently realizing he was walking into dangerous territory. "Because it means you're secure. It means I don't have to worry about taking care of you when you get older. And I guess it means the inheritance situation is different than I thought. But that's not the relationship we have." Michael sat back heavily, the weight of his situation finally becoming clear. "So there's nothing I can do? This decision is final?" "The legal documents are final," Susie said, "but they're not the end of the story." "What do you mean?" Susie returned to her chair, studying her son's face. For the first time since he'd arrived, she saw something that looked like genuine distress rather than just injured entitlement. "I mean that wills can be changed. People can learn and grow. Relationships can be rebuilt." "Are you saying there's a way to fix this?" "I'm saying there's a way to fix you," Susie said bluntly. "But it would require you to fundamentally change how you see me and how you treat me. It would require you to do the work of building a real relationship with me based on mutual respect, rather than expectation and convenience." Michael leaned forward eagerly. "I can do that. I want to do that. Just tell me what you need." "It's not about what I need, Michael. It's about who you choose to become." Susie pulled out a sheet of paper she'd prepared earlier. "If you're serious about change, here's what it looks like." She handed him the list, watching his expression as he read through her conditions. First, you'll enter therapy to work on your empathy and communication skills. Not couples therapy or family therapy, but individual therapy focused on understanding why you've developed such a dismissive attitude toward people who care about you. Michael nodded quickly. Okay, I can do that. Second, you'll take financial responsibility for your own life. No more loans from me, no more bailouts, no more funding your lifestyle through my resources. You'll live within your actual means and learn to manage money without a safety net. His nodding slowed, but he didn't object. Third, you'll demonstrate genuine interest in my life and achievements. You'll learn about my business, my clients, my goals. You'll ask questions about my experiences and listen to the answers without trying to manage or dismiss my feelings. That sounds reasonable, Michael said, though his voice was less confident. Fourth, you'll make amends to the people you've affected with your behavior. You'll apologize to your colleagues for misrepresenting my financial situation and using me as a credential. You'll volunteer at St. Catherine's shelter for 6 months to understand what real hardship looks like. Michael's face paled. You want me to apologize to my coworkers? That could affect my professional reputation. Your professional reputation is built on lies and assumptions. It needs to be affected. Susie's voice was firm. If you're not willing to face the consequences of your behavior, then you're not ready to change it. And if I do all of this, if I complete every item on this list, then we'll rebuild our relationship slowly and carefully. And maybe, if you demonstrate genuine change over a period of years, I'll consider modifying my estate plans. Susie paused. But Michael, you need to understand that this isn't a transaction. I'm not offering you a way to earn back your inheritance. I'm offering you a chance to become the kind of person who deserves a relationship with me. Michael stared at the list, his internal struggle visible on his face. How long would this take? As long as it takes. Real change doesn't happen on a timeline. And there's no guarantee that I'll get the money back even if I do everything you're asking? There's no guarantee of anything, Susie said. That's what makes it a choice, rather than a manipulation. Michael was quiet for a long time, reading and rereading her conditions. Finally, he looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen since he was a child. I think I understand now why you did this, he said slowly. I think I understand what kind of person I've become. Tell me. I've become someone who thinks about you in terms of what you can do for me rather than who you are. Someone who doesn't see you as a complete person with your own life and achievements. Michael's voice was quiet, thoughtful. Someone who would abandon his mother at a shelter and then act like she was being dramatic for being upset about it. Susie felt a flicker of hope, the first she'd experienced since this whole process began. And how does that make you feel? Ashamed, Michael said simply. Really ashamed. And scared. Scared of what? Scared that I might be too late. Scared that I've damaged our relationship so badly that it can't be fixed. He looked at her with eyes that reminded her of the little boy he used to be. Scared that I might have lost the most important person in my life because I was too arrogant to see what I was doing. Susie felt tears prick her eyes, but she kept her voice steady. It's not too late, Michael. But it is going to be hard work, and it's going to require you to be honest about some very uncomfortable truths about yourself. I know, and I want to do the work, not because of the money, but because I want to be someone you can be proud of again. Michael stood up, moving toward her chair. Mom, can I hug you? I know I don't deserve it, but I haven't really hugged you in years, and I think I forgot how much I missed it. Susie stood and embraced her son, feeling the tension in his body as he realized how much he'd missed this simple connection. They held each other for a long moment, both of them crying quietly. I love you, Michael whispered. I know I haven't shown it well, But I do love you. I love you too, Susie replied. That's why this was so important. I couldn't watch you become someone I didn't recognize and pretend it was okay. When they separated, Michael wiped his eyes and picked up the list again. I'll start therapy next week, and I'll talk to my supervisor about reducing my hours so I can volunteer at the shelter. That's a good start, Susie said. But remember, this isn't about checking boxes. It's about genuinely changing how you see the world and the people in it. I understand. And Mom, thank you. For what? For not giving up on me. For caring enough to force me to see what I'd become. Michael smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. For being stronger than I ever gave you credit for. 6 months later, Susie sat in the same living room, but everything had changed. Michael visited every Sunday, not because he needed anything but because he genuinely enjoyed spending time with her. He'd completed his volunteer commitment at the shelter and had chosen to continue working there one evening a week. His therapy sessions had helped him understand the roots of his entitlement and dismissiveness, and he'd begun building genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than utility. Most importantly, he'd learned to see his mother as Susan Walker, successful entrepreneur and remarkable woman, rather than just as Mom, the support system for his life. The inheritance question remained unresolved, and Michael had stopped asking about it entirely. He'd restructured his lifestyle to match his actual income and had begun building his own savings and investment portfolio. He'd also started dating someone new, a social worker who shared his newfound interest in helping others rather than just accumulating status symbols. As they sat together reviewing his therapy progress, Susie realized that she'd gotten something far more valuable than compliance with her conditions. She'd gotten her son back, the real version rather than the entitled stranger he'd become. I have something for you, she said, reaching into her desk drawer. Michael looked up from the book he'd been reading, one of the business biographies she'd recommended. What is it? Susie handed him an envelope. New estate planning documents. Michael's expression became cautious. Are you sure you want me to see these? I don't want you to think I'm only doing this work because of money. I know you're not, Susie said. That's exactly why I want you to see them. Michael opened the envelope and read through the updated will, his eyes widening as he processed the changes. The new document split her estate between charitable organizations and a substantial trust fund for Michael, with conditions that ensured the money would be used responsibly, and that a significant portion would continue to benefit others, even after her death. This is incredibly generous, he said, looking up at her with genuine gratitude. But are you sure? I mean, I haven't earned this back yet. You've earned the chance to prove you'll use it well, Susie said. The trust has provisions that require you to continue your volunteer work and to use a percentage of the funds for charitable purposes. It's not just money, Michael. It's a responsibility. I understand, he said, setting the documents aside. And I'm honored that you trust me with it. I trust the man you're becoming, Susie corrected. The man you're choosing to be. That evening, after Michael had left for his apartment, Susie sat in her garden with a cup of tea and reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The shelter incident that had seemed so devastating had actually been a gift, forcing both of them to confront truths they'd been avoiding for years. She thought about the women she'd met at St. Catherine's, women who were fighting real battles, with courage and dignity. Her experience there had lasted only one night, but it had changed everything. It had shown her that she was stronger than she'd known, and that her resources could make a real difference in the world. The shelter now bore a small plaque by the front door. The Susan Walker Family Center, dedicated to supporting women in their journey toward independence and security. It was funded by an endowment that would ensure its operation for decades to come, a legacy that meant more to Susie than any business success or property acquisition. Michael had been the one to suggest the plaque, understanding finally that his mother's name deserved recognition for her generosity rather than dismissal, for her supposed limitations. As the sun set over her garden, Susie smiled at the irony of it all. Michael had abandoned her at a shelter thinking she was powerless and pathetic. Instead, he'd introduced her to her own strength and given her the clarity she needed to build, the life and legacy she truly wanted. The real joke, she thought, had never been about inheritance or money. It had been about a young man who thought he knew everything about a woman he'd never bothered to really see. And the punchline was that the woman he'd underestimated had always held all the cards. She'd just been too generous to play them. Now she was playing to win, and everyone was benefiting from the game. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.